Hello and welcome. We're obviously coming to you live from our studios in Auckland Park, Johannesburg. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is the week ahead with myself, Liesl Wilson. Let's get straight into the stories for today. The Judicial Service Commission is set to begin its interview process for the 2 vacant seats in the Apex Court. Other news, National Institute for Communicable Diseases says 4 more people have died from COVID-19 related complications. This is in the latest reporting cycle. And in sports, Mamelodi Sundowns are oozing with confidence after they finished unbeaten and on top of Group A in the CAF Champions League. All right, those will look at your headlines. Let's take a look at what we can expect in the week ahead. The Basic Education Department is now the custodian of early childhood development, and it was officially transferred to them from the Social Development Department in Pretoria this past week. The migration was first announced during President Cyril Ramaphosa's 2019 State of the Nation address. Perhaps to unpack more of this, we will bring in the Department of Basic Education spokesperson, Elijah Mhlanga. A very good afternoon to you, Elijah. Thank you for joining us here on the SABC.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting us. Really appreciate it.
Well, let's get straight into it then. This move is said to be a culmination process that was first introduced by the president back in 2019 during the State of the Nation address. And I wonder, for context, can you please expand on what exactly it entails?
Well, what is happening is that our visits to other countries around the world where we're studying other education systems, we found that the early childhood development function was in the care of the Department of Education in most countries where we visited. But when we came back home, we found that we were not aligned with what was there in the rest of the world. And we felt, therefore, that for us to help fix the basic education system, we needed to look at what happens at the foundation phase, or even before school can actually start for children. So we therefore needed to proceed and conduct studies, research, which confirmed that indeed this was a requirement that we needed to fulfill by aligning education right from year 0 to exit level with grade 12.
Yeah, Elijah, with this migration, I wonder if you can expand on the significance of the Department of Basic Education taking on this function from the Department of Social Development. And I ask this obviously because the move will result in the migration of the responsibility of early childhood development centers from the Department of Social Development to the Department of Basic Education. Walk us through what this migration is then going to look like in reality.
Well, in reality, it means that the function that was there with the Department of Social Development would now be the function that is undertaken by the Department of Basic Education. And this includes registering early childhood development centers, developing programs in terms of curriculum, and also aligning other activities, and also monitoring the delivery of education programs at early childhood development phase, because we're told that the first 1,000 days in a child from birth are very important, and we want to close that gap that was there, that resulted in some of our children not finishing school because they did not have a solid foundation in terms of their schooling. So what we are doing now is to make sure that one department takes care of a child's education from when they are born until when they exit the basic education system. So it's a function that is now going to be with education, but of course the Department of Social Development will continue to play its role in terms of psychosocial support services, child grants, and other similar services.
Well, speaking about, the approach, and I mean, early on you mentioned how you studied, other education systems around the world, and perhaps also the importance that ECD serves in terms of providing a foundation for those who are entering the school system at large. How will the approach be different from what the Department of Social Development, did in terms of managing this function? And when exactly is all this set to then roll out? When will be the first phase of that?
Well, the first phase that started now from the 1st of April. So the function has shifted not only the function, but the people who are working in the Department of Social Development at national and provincial level. All of those colleagues have now joined the Department of Education in a province or basic education at national level. So that's what is happening. The budget that used to be managed by the Department of Social Development in terms of paying subsidies to ECD centers has now become the responsibility of basic education. So that is one thing that has also taken place. But in terms of the key responsibilities, education, we are specialists when it comes to curriculum. All learning is part of what we do, and now we are moving it further down to ECD, not just from foundation phase and primary school only, but from preschool. So that's what we are strong in. That's our core mandate, education. Social development, on the other hand, provides social services, psychosocial services, child grant, all those support services that are required for a child to grow up being taken care of by the government, but also coordinating stakeholders in communities to make sure that parents play their part in taking responsibility of their children, but those NGOs as well that are taking care of children, especially the vulnerable, are also encouraged to continue to do what they're doing in a coordinated environment.
Elijah Mhlanga, thank you very much for your time. Again, Elijah Mhlanga is the Department of Basic Education spokesperson. Again, just chatting to us about the Department of Education, the Basic Education Department, rather, has now, become the custodian of early childhood development. He was obviously speaking about the implementation process that's going to unfold. This comes after President Cyril Ramaphosa announced this migration back in 2019 of the state during the State of the Nation address, and Elijah was just giving us more context to that. This as it came into effect on the 1st of April. Let's take a look at other news now. Obviously, ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa is expected to close the Mpumalanga conference. Just yesterday, Mandla Ndlovu was elected the new provincial chairperson with Speedy Mashilo as his deputy, Wuzi Chirwa as the secretary, and Lindiwe Njali as the deputy secretary. The president is currently in a closed session, and we will take you live to Emma Lahleni as soon as he comes out. But perhaps staying, in other news as we continue to monitor that story and what's developing as we wait for the president. We also understand that April marks Freedom Month and celebrating the country's first non-racial democratic elections of 1994. We've seen that many voted for the very first time. This also happened to see South Africa adopting its electoral system during the process of making a new constitution in the run-up to its transition to democracy in 1994, using a proportional representation system. It obviously involves parties drawing up lists of representatives which would get seats in legislatures according to the proportion of votes that the parties won within the polls. But the question we're asking is, are we edging any closer to electoral reform? Professor Barry Hanyani from the University of the Northwest joins us to reflect further. Prof, a very good afternoon to you, and thank you for joining us here.
Very good day to you, Lizdell. Good day to your viewers.
Prof, proportional representation, as we've come to understand, was chosen because it was seen as allowing for the maximum representation of different political opinions, ethnic identities. But to date, some have come to question its effectiveness in holding accountability. Some feel that power is perhaps too concentrated within the party bosses themselves. And there seems to be less emphasis on the people who actually voted them in. What are your thoughts?
I think one needs to go back to the multi-party talks. Remember, we had CODESA 1 and 2, the demise, and then we had the multi-party talks themselves. And the understanding was, let's have proportional representation, first post system. And it worked to a point where, unfortunately, there was the emergence of hegemony, especially by the current majority party, which is the ANC. So the question would be asked, was there a true representation of the party process, taking into account, some kind of balance of a kind? And there wasn't such a thing, right? The ANC was enjoying its full majority. At some stage, you remember, we had a 2/3 majority. And the question was that not stifling alternative voices that otherwise would end up with a fear that we would have a one-party state. And obviously, when you talk about one-party state, you talk about so many fears, you talk about so many reservations, political and otherwise, that could have ended up into a very uncomfortable situation. So fast forward, you then had a number of opposition parties, the likes of General Holomisa, Musiwa Likota and others, my money included, who at some stage were of the view that electoral reforms were a way to go. So that in the end, the multiplicity of voices and representation obviously is maintained in the process. And that's why the Constitutional Court ended up with that outcome to say, given the fact that, and quite ironic here in Potchefstroom, Mr. Kam and others who won the fight in the Constitutional Court to have your so-called independent candidates for municipalities. So we needed to replicate the same, but more so under the disguise of a broader reformed process. And it's quite interesting that in the last few weeks, we've had a chance to interact with a number of members of the public to share their views around this issue. And so come 2024, we're likely to have a new template of the electoral process.
Prof, let's get into that then. As you alluded to, calls for electoral reform have been growing louder and louder, and obviously now having received a boost by the Constitutional Court's ruling last year, June, which is forcing the issue by calling for amendments to the Electoral Act and, amongst other amendments. And I wonder, what electoral systems are then available for perhaps more democratic representation and democratic governance at large? Also, perhaps to increase citizen and voter agency. What proposals and recommendations on the table as we speak?
Listen, it's too early. There could be points for consideration,
Okay.
right? Take the issue, for instance, of independent candidates. What is the threshold? So we need to thresh that out. Issues of capacity, I'm quite concerned about the ability to mobilize resources for those independent candidates. And in the end, remember, we already have your National Assembly of about 400 members, plus somewhere around 90 plus in the NCOP. So the question is, how then do we crunch the numbers so that in the end, we're able to accommodate for independent candidates as well? And we then reflect on the number of seats in Parliament, which will then be representative across the board of all those who are able to compete and, of course, get the threshold that we talk about. So these are things that will be threshed out eventually and subjected now to scrutiny further to say, from a numbers perspective, this is the formula, this is the way to go. So we wait with that, much as we've seen the consultative process almost being concluded.
Yeah. Well, speaking about those points of considerations then, let's maybe look at some of the ramifications, the immediate challenges that arise based, you did mention earlier on issues of resourcing, the criteria, campaigning at large, and I wonder even issues related to the Party Funding Act and provisions, related to that. In the same breath, what is the impact of an electoral system on women's representation at large in South Africa?
Look, and I'm glad you've touched on that. So in the end, our new reforms, as it were, and I'm using the word template very carefully, will then need to reflect on all these issues. The issue of funding, the issue of women representation. Thank goodness, so far, this has been largely being driven by your party caucuses. And a lot of our political parties have come to party to say it's important that rank and file members actually should be the ones who take the baton and say, let it be women who are in the forefront of councillors. Let it be women who are in the forefront of your provincial MPLs. Let it be the women who occupy much of the spaces in the National Assembly, for instance, including the NCOP, by the way.
Yes, do continue, Prof. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So Liesl, I thought you were coming in there. So what is happening here is that we've gained considerable coverage on women participation. I'm sketching my head in terms of stats, firstly in the continent, but secondly in Western democracies. And my understanding is that we are not far-fetched, at least from a 50+ position of women representation, especially in Parliament.
So, Prof, you know, with the amendments, I mean, will the amended electoral system ultimately bring with it more checks and balances and greater accountability against, you know, the fight against so that we can fight corruption, perhaps also cementing the current, or will it rather cement the current majorities in Parliament? And I ask that because, you know, we're obviously seeing some of the latest IEC interviews that are having been conducted and issues of legitimacy that came out these past local government elections, etc. We're obviously also wanting to look at voter apathy at large. What are your closing sentiments on that?
Well, the good news is that there is the healthy scorecard, and I'm trying to be safe here and very careful. Scorecard in the sense that, unlike in other African countries, and I'm tempted here to bring in issues and allegations of Zimbabwe, for instance.
You know, Prof, we're going to have to leave the conversation there, unfortunately. We do have to cross to other live news coming in, but I want to thank you for your time again, just chatting to us about some of the calls for electoral reform. We shine a spotlight on that during the month of April. Professor Baranyani from the Northwest University, as well as a political analyst, giving us that update. Let's move on to the South African Communist Party, who is currently holding a media briefing. The media briefing comes after the party's Central Committee meeting. Let's take you live to that now.
Program and develop what we now call strategic perspectives and tasks for the next 5 years and beyond. Our program remains grounded on the necessity to drive a second, more radical phase of the national democratic revolution as our most direct route to socialism. At the heart of our political evaluation at Congress will be the imperative to realize lasting solutions to the socio-economic challenges affecting the workers and the poor, who are the overwhelming majority of our people. These are a reflection. The situation facing the majority of our people is a reflection of the broader crises affecting capitalism globally, which includes the current COVID-19 pandemic, the economic crisis, which in our case is characterized by very high levels of poverty, inequality, and unemployment, as well as the associated multiple crises of social reproduction. In other words, the inability of many of our families and communities to make ends meet, as well as also we are meeting in the context where we are faced with an aggravating climate change situation. The Central Committee received and discussed a political report, which I presented in my capacity as General Secretary of the SACP, and also received a report on the state of the organization and other secretariat reports, as well as the draft discussion document on the update of our program, the South African Road to Socialism. And the report also that we received on the constitutional amendments, that is the SACP constitution. not the country's constitution. Regarding the updated party program, the SACP will, before the end of the day tomorrow, 4th of April 2022, publicly release this discussion document titled The South African Struggle for Socialism, which reflects on the strategic perspectives of the party, but it's largely our updated program, the South African Road to Socialism. So we are releasing that publicly tomorrow as we release it to all our structures. We hope that the media will engage with us as they also themselves cover the document which we are releasing tomorrow. The SACP will, in the next few weeks, publicly release other discussion documents which also relate to our program, resolutions, and declaration that will be discussed and adopted at our 15th Congress. These will include discussion documents on important topics that we have identified, which includes energy security, climate change and environmental degradation, the struggle against patriarchy, the necessity to build a left popular front, the economic situation, and the struggle for the transformation of the financial sector, amongst others. The 15th SACP National Congress will also elect new national office bearers and a central committee for a 5-year term, which will end in July 2027. Now, on the year 2022, which is also a year of congresses for many of our formations, the SACP regards the holding of these congresses as necessitating organizational renewal or as important platforms to take forward organizational renewal and program-based unity of our alliance and the broader movement. This year, 2022, is also the year of the 14th COSATU National Congress and the 55th ANC National Conference. The components of alliance formations, including the Young Communist League of South Africa, the ANC Youth League, the ANC Women's League, and the reconstituted military veterans of our movement association, will also hold their national conference.
All right, let's take a quick ad break. We'll continue to bring you more from that live briefing on the other side of this. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. All right, welcome back. Let's take a look at other news that is obviously making headlines on the week ahead. We've seen that with 2 vacant seats on the Concourt, the Judicial Service Commission is set to begin its interview process on Monday, where 5 of the country's top jurists are to be interviewed on Tuesday in Sandton, Johannesburg. Now, Advocate Alan Dodson is the first on the list, and he was unsuccessful in his bid to secure green robe last year.
That was quite young.
Advocate Alan Christopher Dodson will make a renewed bid to occupy a vacant seat in the Apex Court. An experienced jurist, he has spent most of his career in the realm of property and human rights law. Dodson's one of the original judges of the Land Claims Court and has also served on the United Nations Housing and Property Claims Commission for almost a decade.
That I chaired the commission that was established by the United Nations in Kosovo that was effectively a judicial position.
Dodson is the only candidate who does not currently hold a position on the bench. However, he has vast experience as an acting judge in the Gauteng High Court, presiding over civil, political rights and commercial law matters. Last year's interview process in April was marred with technical difficulties, with the former Chief Justice chairing the panel via live stream. The process was also highly criticized for the manner it was conducted. Following litigation, the shortlist was set aside with the second batch of interviews in October. Dotson was unsuccessful in both attempts to secure a seat at the apex court. Hasina Gori, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Our Judge Faiza Kasri Setelwane is also making a renewed bid for a seat on the bench of the Constitutional Court this year, where the Judicial Service Commission begins its interview process next week in Sandton. Kasri Setelwane was shortlisted by the JSC twice last year for the position.
A fourth attempt for the coveted seat at the highest court in the country. No stranger to these benches, Judge Faiza Kasri Setelwane began her career at the Concourt, serving as a clerk for Justice Yvonne Mogoro on the first ever bench of the court. She had a brief acting stint in 2017. This brought her conduct into question after a complaint of mistreatment was lodged against her by law clerks, which included the daughter of current Supreme Court of Appeal President Mandisa Maya. Kasri Setelwane is an experienced jurist, having acted in the appellate courts. She was shortlisted in both the April and October 2021 interviews. Hasina Gori, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Our Judge Mahube Molumela has also been one of the candidates interviewed for the coveted spot on the bench of the Constitutional Court. Take a look.
No, I was never...
Judge Mahube Molumela is a rising star in the judicial firmament. Appointed to the Free State High Court in 2008, Molumela headed the division 8 years later. She then ascended to the Supreme Court of Appeal. She had also spent 2 terms at the Apex Court in 2015. Molumela was also a military judge. During her interviews last year, she described how being female meant she had to fight harder to be recognized. Molumela was interviewed twice last year and lamented on the slow transformation of the judiciary. Molumela made the shortlist in both the April and October interviews, but was unsuccessful in securing her spot on the Concourt bench. Hasina Gori, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Our Western Cape High Court Judge Owen Rogers is a newcomer attempting to secure position at the Apex Court. Rogers acted in 2021 at the Constitutional Court for the first time and has been a judge in various appellate courts. He will be the 4th candidate to be interviewed in this round of Judicial Service Commission interviews.
Title was Argument.
Judge Owen Rogers joined the Cape Bar in 1988, considered one of the country's top senior counsel. He was appointed to the High Court as a judge in 2013. Rogers was an acting judge at the Supreme Court of Appeal from 2017 to 2019 and again last year. However, he seems to have some detractors. Last year, he attempted to join the Supreme Court of Appeal. That was unsuccessful. Rogers is one of the candidates who will be interviewed for the 2 spots on the Concourt bench. Hasina Gori, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Our High Court Judge David Antelharter makes another bid for a seat on the Apex Court. Having been interviewed twice last year and was unsuccessful in both rounds, the Judicial Service Commission is set to interview 5 candidates for 2 positions at the Constitutional Court next week.
High Court Judge David Antelharter has enjoyed a celebrated legal career, appearing in various high-profile cases. Antelharter also acted on behalf of Cyril Ramaphosa when, as deputy president, he was called to participate in the Marikana Commission of Inquiry. Considered one of the sharpest legal minds in the country, Antelharter has worked as an academic and lawyer through his career. He also spent stints acting at the Competition Appeal Court, Supreme Court of Appeal, and Concourt. Despite a lengthy career as a lawyer, Antelharter has only been at the High Court for 3 years, significantly shorter than other candidates.
Ultimately, it's not a question of whether I should be required to wait or anyone else should. It's a question of what does the court need? What's going to be good for the court? What's going to be good for the legal system?
Last year, Antelharter was unsuccessful in both the April and October round of interviews. Hasina Gori, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Judgment should be delivered in the CC.
All right, welcome back. This is the week ahead with myself, Liesl Wilson. The South African Communist Party is currently addressing the media. Dr. Blade Nzimande, General Secretary of the SACP, is currently speaking. Let's take you live there again.
State-owned enterprises, as well as expanding and diversifying the publicly owned economic sector, should be amongst our key economic transformation priorities. The state has a key role to play in the economy, including through direct participation on behalf of the people as a whole, through, amongst others, well-governed and thriving state-owned enterprises, and through employment creation and direct leadership in economic development and structural transformation. Advancing these developmental perspectives and rejecting both neoliberalism and state capture, these, we believe, should be the basis upon which we must seek to build the unity of our alliance and broader movement. Finally, on this matter, we must unite around and strengthen our collective efforts to fight other forms of corruption, criminality, and lawlessness in our country. For example, we do need to fight the so-called business forums that are hijacking public infrastructure projects in particular. And we are calling upon the security cluster to clamp down on these, because what we sometimes do not realize is that the activities of these so-called business forums, like Amadela Ngokubona, it actually affects the ordinary people and the ordinary workers who are actually employed in these projects, but they get disrupted and their incomes get negatively affected. To this end, therefore, the Central Committee welcomed the changes in leadership emerging within the South African Police Service, especially the appointment of the new commissioner. We welcome the decisiveness in this regard by the president and government. On unemployment and the necessity for structural transformation, the SACP is deeply concerned about the rising crisis-high unemployment levels in terms of the official definition that excludes discouraged work seekers. Unemployment increased to its highest levels ever, at 35.3% in the fourth quarter of 2021, despite declining fractionally to 46.2% in the fourth quarter of 2021, from its highest in the third quarter of 2021, 46.6%. Total unemployment represented by the expanded definition that includes discouraged work seekers remained at a catastrophic level. In other words, the 46.6% it includes everyone who's unemployed, both still looking for work and those who have actually given up. This catastrophe is affecting a 12.5 million strong population of active and discouraged work seekers, with youth unemployment being the highest of all age categories. The most affected national groups, regardless of age and gender, are Black Africans, followed by Coloureds, who are followed by Indian, Asian sections of our population. Meanwhile, with an official unemployment rate of 4.2% above the national average, Black African women are the most affected in terms of gender. Their expanded unemployment rate is at a staggering 50.8%, which is about the same level as the expanded unemployment rate of Black Africans at 50.7%. The racial and gender dimensions of unemployment should be understood as drawing attention to the continuous reproduction of the legacy of apartheid in our economy post-1994. Therefore, we cannot overemphasize the importance of redress in employment creation programs and interventions. And this should include rigorous pursuit of cooperatives and small, medium, and micro enterprise development as part of the necessity to advance, widen, and deepen structural economic transformation. Besides addressing unemployment towards securing the right of all to work, structural economic transformation must radically reduce inequality, eradicate poverty, and resolve the associated crisis of social reproduction. During the table of the 2022-2023 fiscal year budget in February this year, the Minister of Finance, Enoch Godongwane, announced that the government was granting the Social Relief Distress Grant, the SRD, a 12-month extension. Instead of terminating the grant at the end of the first quarter of 2022, the government should maintain the grant and consider improving it gradually towards a universal basic income grant as part of building a comprehensive social security system. This is what the continuing unemployment crisis, unfortunately, calls for in the here and now. The government introduced this grant at the height of COVID-19 pandemic, following public calls, including those from the SACP, in the second quarter of 2020, as over 2.2 million jobs were slashed in a jobs bloodbath, principally by capitalist bosses, which further deepened unemployment. On the National Union of Mine Workers Congress, the Central Committee congratulates the National Union of Mine Workers, NUM, for concluding its National Congress successfully this week, as well as the entire collective of new national office bearers on their election. In the same vein, the Central Committee expressed its sincere gratitude to the former national office bearers of the Union who served their membership with dedication, and also for convening the Congress. Our message to all NUM members is that please support the collective of the newly elected national office bearers so that you can consolidate your own unity and grow the union from strength to strength. On the auctioning off of the high-frequency spectrum, the Central Committee reiterated the reservations and disapproval expressed already by the SACP, both within the alliance structures and during engagements and through open public policy statements on the decision to auction off the high rate of frequency broadband spectrum. In expressing a different view, underpinned by our own thorough analysis of the ICT net sector, the SACP stressed the necessity of handling the governance of the high rate of frequency spectrum as a national asset, so as to demonopolize and transform the information and communications technology network sector, the ICT sector. The SACP anchors its proposal on the need to build a capable developmental state that serves the people regardless of their geographical location. We also have due regard to the responsibility of the state to ensure national security, manage disasters, and our overall developmental needs. The SACP underlined the need to develop democratic state control of national assets in order to eliminate uneven development, including paying priority attention to rural development. Democratic state control of the high radio frequency spectrum and its governance could play a key role to bridge the digital divide, to spread connectivity infrastructure across the length and breadth of our country, including in the rural areas. As part of this imperative, South Africa must strive to universalize access to the internet and digital and mobile communication and related opportunities. It is therefore important to lower access to high radio frequency broadband infrastructure-based communication data, including through a rollout of free Wi-Fi hotspots in a nationally coordinated development effort. That is why we welcome the government intentions to supply on a family basis the necessary data that is needed in society. In doing this, we are also of the view that we must place a premium on high radio frequency broadband spectrum access services by the working class and poor communities across the country. These are some of the perspectives and campaigns that the SACP will continue driving and also engage on within our alliance. The SACP will also continue engaging and forging a campaign around the policy of wireless open access network, which the government dropped to pave the way for the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa to auction off the high radio frequency broadband spectrum on a highway speed. Particular attention will also have to be paid to the demonopolization of the mobile communication and internet service providers space by allowing more participants, including democratic worker and community-controlled cooperatives and SMMEs in this sphere. Finally, on the digital matters, the rollout of digital set-top boxes or decoders for working class and poor families must be completed on a countrywide basis as a matter of urgency. The switch off of the analog broadcasting signal to the digital broadcasting signal without first ensuring that all working class and poor families are covered with the rollout of the set-top boxes has left the affected families without access to television broadcasting. This also amounts to depriving the affected families of access to public broadcasting services. The last issue that the Central Committee discussed is what we refer to as the NATO, Ukraine and Russia conflict. The imperialist instrument of war called NATO is the principal cause of the conflict in Ukraine through its expansion aimed at encircling Russia on several fronts and more possibly with China as the ultimate target. The Central Committee reiterated the SACP's call to all whom it may concern, to NATO as well as to Russia and to Ukraine, to stop the conflict in Ukraine with immediate effect. This must include the United States-controlled NATO both stopping and reversing and ending its imperialist expansion and wars. Therefore, the Central Committee reiterated the call made by the SACP here in our country: no to imperialist war in Ukraine or any other part of the world. As the SACP, we stand for peace and not war, which involves, as war often involves, loss of life and an increase in the hardships facing the working class and the poor, including driving up the prices of food, energy, and other basic necessities. Therefore, pointing out to the facts about the principal imperialist agenda and the destructive history of NATO and its expansionist aggression does not mean that we support any side in the war taking place in Ukraine. This is one reason we are emphatic on our call for a total end of war and the respect for human rights in Ukraine with immediate effect. However, through its expansion, NATO seeks not only to extend its sphere of military presence and domination, but in the end to entrench monopoly of the world economy through its transnational corporations to control natural resources, other markets in other countries, and global regions. How can we as Africans ever forget that which underpinned NATO in 2011, bombarding of Libya, causing massive destruction and loss of life? Joe Biden, the current president of the United States, was its vice president when that happened. Taking control of Libyan oil was, of course, the key factor. Besides private wealth accumulation by the capitalist forces who control the military-industrial complex in the United States and other NATO members, depends on acts of war. That is why around mid-March this year, for example, President Biden announced that the total amount that the US will pump into Ukraine in weapons of war and other military spending amounted to $1 billion. And in the week before then, and with an astronomical increase compared to the $2.7 billion the US already pumped into Ukraine in weapons of war and other military spending. Now, we are calling for an end to this war. But we are also of the view, as the SACP, that this one-sided, all of a sudden focus on the Ukraine and total abandonment and ignoring of wars that are being waged in other parts of the world, especially by imperialism, is not correct. As we fight for an end to conflict in the Ukraine, we dare not forget about other regions that are facing wars. The butchering of the Palestinian people by the Israeli government with the support of the United States. We dare not forget about the plight of the Palestinian people right now. We dare not also forget about the destabilization of Syria, the destabilization of Panama, for instance, as well as the almost genocidal war that is taking place in Yemen at this point in time. It can't be that blood that is flowing in Ukraine is regarded as more important than the blood of Palestinian and the children in Yemen or the elderly that are also being killed in a place like Syria. Also, it is a time to actually say the United States continue with its illegal blockade of Cuba, causing hardships for the Cuban people. We dare not forget about that. In fact, for all peace-loving people in South Africa and the world, we must be using these opportunities to say there must be an end to all wars, not just in Ukraine, yes, in Ukraine, but to all wars in all parts of the world. Because unless we do so, we are by default encouraging ongoing destabilization of regions, especially by the powerful countries. The SACP stands for a just and peaceful world, and we are firmly opposed to all wars, including imperialist wars that are being waged all over the world. Thank you very much. That is the end of our statement.
Thank you, GS. I will now move quickly and take questions from members of the media. I will ask that when you ask your question, please say your name and the media house you come from. And we allow this to be an interaction. I will take questions, as I said, and thereafter ask the leadership to answer those questions. The opportunity is now open for questions. You can raise your hand. I have people assisting who will bring my attention to the hands if there is any, and we will take things from there. This can be an unlawful strike. You know, Comrade Soli, I come from industry where I used to lead strikes and later handle the strikes. So when you embark on a strike action, you give a notice. I can see we have Mokobo CEO on the screen. Perhaps that is for asking a question. But let me check if there are hands. This digital hands, you know, this digital hand platform. I can't really close this press briefing. Ladies and gentlemen, we are inviting hands for questions on the statement presented by the General Secretary of the SACP, Dr. Blade Nzimande, and the second Deputy General Secretary of the party, Comrade Chris Chai Mashako.
No questions, Comrade Alex.
No, that is an unlawful strike. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for this opportunity and for covering our press briefing. Let me, before I close this press briefing session, return back to the national office bearers of the SACP to check if there are areas of emphasis or additions. Mapaila is joining the strike. You know, I would have wondered if Mapaila doesn't join the strike, it would not have been a legitimate strike. Comrade Chair and Comrade...
Right, live visuals coming through. Obviously, Dr. Blade Nzimande, the General Secretary of the SACP, addressing the media after a Central Committee meeting where they discussed and issued on a number of issues. Lastly, also calling for the end to the Ukraine-Russia-NATO conflict. That briefing was taking place today. Let's, from this SACP media briefing, cross over to the Mpumalanga province, in fact, where ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa is also expected to close the Mpumalanga conference later today. Just yesterday, we saw Mandla Ndlovu elected as the new provincial chairperson, amongst others taking prominent positions. Let's take you live to that briefing as it unfolds.
Of Mpumalanga province, having met at Emalahleni with Bengdem Resort from the 1st to the 3rd of April 2022, convened under the theme of defending the gains of our freedom through renewal and unity of the African National Congress. That we reaffirm that the ANC, which is united and cohesive, remains a potent and relevant instrument of socio-economic liberation in the hands of our people. This elective army of delegates present here today, in almost through the entire debates, were also joined by our alliance partners, the South African Communist Party, COSATU, SANCO, and the leagues. The delegates, in their collective wisdom, deliberated and came to a common understanding and realization that we came to the conference being divided, and therefore affirm our commitment to the unity and the renewal of the ANC, the importance of selecting quality leaders, transforming membership into cadres that will successfully prosecute the social transformation struggle, which is underpinned by the 5 pillars, namely the state, the economy, organizational work, ideological work, and institutional work. There's been a growing factionalism, the us and nobody else culture, and or tendency of pursuing personal interests crudely at all costs, as it is demonstrated during our preparations for the local government elections 2021. And recent excesses demonstrated in certain parts of our sub-regions in preparation for this conference, and as such, the delegates affirmed that among the local government elections performance is a clear indication that the ANC is on a path of losing trust from the public. Therefore, the conference committed itself to a revolutionary journey of addressing factionalism and divisions in all the structures. Mandla took my water. In this regard, the conference agreed that indeed the most important matter in our current state is an obligation to build a strong ANC so that it justly claims to be better leader of society. This commitment resonated from all delegates in their devotion to endeavor to build a new cadre with high levels of revolutionary conduct as a culture, principle of, and values of the movement are getting eroded. Therefore, the delegates agreed that a revolutionary movement got to be led by revolutionaries with high level of revolutionary morals. The latter is espoused by the current tribulations of some unusual conduct of members of the ANC. We as the delegates reaffirm the ANC commitment for isolating and rooting out corrupt practices from among our ranks and in government sector that the ANC have control on.